The pink carry-on rolling beneath Faith Morris's hand felt impossibly light, yet it carried the weight of something far greater than its physical form. At 13 years old, she was about to do something she'd never done before. She was going to fly alone. No parent, no guardian, just her intelligence, and the careful instructions her mother had drilled into her 100 times over. Faith stood at Gate B20 of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in Atlanta, Georgia. She watched planes taxi and take off through the enormous windows. The afternoon sunlight streamed across the polished floor. Nervous energy practically vibrated through her small frame. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her grey hoodie suddenly felt too warm despite the airport's industrial air conditioning. Inside her backpack, carefully folded and tucked away, was a cardigan her mother had given her. A soft grey thing that smelled like her mother's perfume. Along with it was a handwritten note that Faith had already read a dozen times that morning. Even when we're apart, we're connected. Show the world who you are. Make me proud. Those words were signed by her mother. Those words had sustained her through her nervousness about flying alone. Faith was a careful girl, intelligent beyond her years. She spoke 3 languages, English, Spanish, Mandarin. She had competed in debate tournaments across 3 states. She was an honor student, the kind of kid teachers called mature for her age. They meant she didn't fidget during lectures. They meant she didn't throw tantrums in the cafeteria. But being mature for 13 and actually feeling mature were 2 different things entirely. She was flying to Washington, D.C. for something special. Though Faith couldn't yet wrap her head around the magnitude of what awaited her there. There was an event at the Capitol, one that her mother had promised would be important. It would matter. It would be a moment she'd remember for the rest of her life. Faith's mother worked in a world of importance and consequence, a world of power that felt distant from Faith's everyday reality. Homework, debate club meetings, the simple concerns of being 13. But today, Faith was stepping into that world. Just for a moment. Just for an event her mother had promised would change something. The boarding announcement came through the speakers. Faith felt her stomach flip. This was real. This was happening. She gathered her resolve. She picked up her carry-on. She joined the line of passengers moving toward the gate. Walking down the jet bridge toward the plane, Faith felt the peculiar sense of crossing a threshold. Behind her was childhood. Ahead was something she couldn't quite name. Not adulthood exactly, but a step in that direction. Her mother had arranged everything with meticulous care. An airport escort through Atlanta, a meeting point with the flight crew, special attention from the flight attendant. But the truth that made Faith's heart race with something between pride and terror was simple. No one would be waiting for her at the gate anymore. She was trusted. She was capable. She was doing this. The flight attendant, a woman with a bright smile, checked her ticket. She welcomed her aboard with particular warmth. Word had apparently gotten around about the 13-year-old flying solo. Faith was used to being noticed, but not always for reasons that felt comfortable. She was often the smartest person in the room. She was often the only black girl in rooms full of white faces, or the only girl interested in policy debate among boys who talked about sports. Being noticed was just part of her life. She found her window seat. Relief washed over her when she realized she had an older woman next to her. Not a stranger her own age, someone older, someone familiar in the way grandmothers are familiar. The woman introduced herself as Harriet Moore, 68 years old, with the kind of warm grandmotherly presence that immediately put Faith at ease. "Traveling alone, sweetheart?" Harriet asked. She noticed how Faith struggled slightly with the overhead bin. "Yes," Faith said. "First time." Harriet reached up and helped her hoist the carry-on into the bin with practiced ease. "How exciting. Where are you headed?" "Washington, D.C., Faith said. "For a special event. How wonderful." Harriet smiled warmly. "You must be very important, I can tell. You have that look about you, like you know who you are." Faith didn't know quite what to say to that, so she smiled and settled into her seat. As the other passengers boarded, she felt herself relax slightly. Harriet was the kind of person you felt safe around. The kind of person who asked about your travels and actually listened to the answer. When Harriet dozed off after takeoff, her head tilted against the window, Faith felt oddly protected by her presence, even in sleep. She pulled out her phone. She found several text messages from her mother. "Hey, sweet girl. Everything okay? Make sure to text me when you land. Proud of you, eh?" Faith typed back, "All good, Mom. Love you." Though she knew in-flight internet could be spotty, she wanted her mother to know something. She wanted her mother to know that this moment was being experienced exactly as hoped. 3,000 miles away, or nearly that, Officer Randall Brooks had no idea. He had no idea that his day was about to intersect with a 13-year-old girl, in a way that would permanently alter the trajectory of his life. Brooks was 41 years old. He had 12 years in federal service, through the Transportation Security Administration. He was a man of medium height, with the kind of face that seemed permanently set in a frown, as if the world had disappointed him in ways too numerous to mention. He had pale blue eyes. They seemed to look through people rather than at them. His jaw jutted forward slightly. giving him the appearance of perpetual disapproval. For the past 6 months, something had been eating at Brooks from the inside. He'd been passed over for promotion, again. The position he'd wanted, sergeant, a supervisory role, had gone to a younger officer, someone with fewer years, but apparently more team compatibility. Brooks had spent 12 years in federal service. He had compiled a record that he believed was solid. He had been passed over twice now. The resentment had calcified into something harder, something more dangerous. It had started to reshape how he saw the world. Brooks had developed a particular way of moving through airports, a particular way of looking at passengers. He saw threats where others saw ordinary people. He saw criminality in the nervous energy of travelers. He saw malice in the natural anxiety of people about to board aircraft. He saw certain kinds of people as inherent risks, young men of color, for instance, or anyone who seemed nervous or agitated. But mostly, he saw people he could never be. People who belonged to communities he suspected of things he couldn't quite articulate. The truth was that Brooks had 18 complaints filed against him over his 12 years of service. 11 of those complaints came from people of color. 8 involved accusations of racial profiling. 6 had been dismissed without investigation. 4 had been quietly settled. The remaining 8 had simply disappeared into administrative channels where they weren't quite forgotten, but weren't quite addressed either. His supervisors knew about these complaints. They had in fact received copies of several, but acknowledging them would have meant action, accountability, and the potential for the kind of institutional upheaval that most law enforcement agencies avoided at almost any cost. No one had ever told Brooks that his behavior was crossing a line. No one had ever sat him down and said, "Officer Brooks, your record suggests a pattern of racial bias. We need to address this." So Brooks had continued doing what he'd been doing, growing increasingly bitter with each missed promotion, each performance review that praised his dedication while noting areas for interpersonal improvement, each interaction that confirmed in his mind that the world had fundamentally wronged him. The flight from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. had been in the air for just under 2 hours. That's when the message came through to the flight crew. It arrived as a phone call to the Flight Operations Center at Reagan National Airport, a call that had originated from an anonymous number, a call that would later prove impossible to trace. "We have a report," the voice on the other end said, "of a suspicious passenger. On flight 2847 arriving from Atlanta, young female, appears to be a teenager. Seat 12C, reported to be acting suspicious, possibly a threat. The details were vague. No specific accusation was made. No behavior was described beyond the word suspicious." The flight operations manager who took the call felt the immediate spike of adrenaline. Any threat report generates that spike, even when the details don't quite add up. The word threat associated with an aircraft changed everything. It had to be taken seriously. It had to be investigated. A message was relayed to the cockpit. The captain was informed of the report, and a secondary message was sent to a federal officer stationed at Reagan National as part of the airport's security detail. That officer was Randall Brooks. When Brooks received the notification about the suspicious teenage passenger, something flickered in his expression, a kind of grim satisfaction, as if this was exactly the kind of thing he'd been expecting all along. A teenage girl acting suspicious. It fit a narrative he'd constructed in his mind, over years of disappointed ambitions and simmering resentment. He made his way to the gate where the flight would arrive. He checked his watch. He mentally prepared himself for what he'd already decided was coming. He didn't question the vague nature of the report. He didn't consider that acting suspicious could mean 1,000 different things, or that it might be code for something entirely innocent. He had constructed a narrative in his mind, and the narrative had a protagonist and a villain. The question was only which role would be assigned to the person in seat 12C. As the plane began its descent into Reagan National Airport, Faith Morris had no idea. She had no idea that her ordinary flight was about to become extraordinary. In the worst possible way, she was mentally preparing herself for this special event, rehearsing in her mind what her mother had told her about the Capitol building, the marble floors, the sense of history that would surround her. She was thinking about the moment when she would see her mother waiting for her, because her mother always waited for her, always made time, always showed up. She had no way of knowing, no way of understanding what was about to happen. She had no way of knowing that Officer Randall Brooks was waiting at the gate, his hands folded over his federal badge, his jaw set in that perpetual expression of disapproval. She had no way of knowing that her entire understanding of safety was about to be profoundly shaken, her entire understanding of authority and of her place in the world. The plane touched down at Reagan National at 4:47 in the afternoon. Faith felt the familiar dip, the slight bounce as the landing gear made contact with the runway. She heard the engines power down. Relief washed over her. She had flown across the country alone. The hard part was over. "You did great," Harriet said, as the passengers began unbuckling and reaching for their belongings. "You should be very proud of yourself." "Thank you," Faith said. And she meant it. The flight had been smooth. She'd handled it well. Now she just needed to collect her luggage, find the airport escort her mother's office had arranged, and get to the capital event. The cabin door opened. Passengers began standing and gathering their things. Faith waited patiently. She'd learned to never rush, always to be courteous in spaces shared with others. She helped Harriet with her bag. When it came time to deplane, she waited for the older woman to exit first. Then she followed behind her, rolling her carry-on behind her. The jet bridge seemed to stretch on forever. Other passengers bustled past her, eager to reach the terminal to begin their next destinations. Faith was moving more slowly, her mind already composing the text message. "I'm here, landing successful," but she never finished that thought. A man in a dark TSA uniform suddenly appeared in the aisle ahead. He was blocking her path. He was not a flight attendant. He wore a federal badge on his belt. His face carried an expression that made something in Faith's chest clench, with sudden, inexplicable fear. "You," the officer said, looking directly at Faith. "Come with me." The words were not requests, they were commands. His tone carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that assumed compliance, that made it clear argument or questioning was not an option. Faith's mouth went dry. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice smaller than she would have liked. "Now," the officer said, "around them." Other passengers began to notice. A few slowed down, their eyes widening slightly as they registered what they were seeing. A girl in a grey hoodie, clearly a teenager, being singled out by law enforcement. "Excuse me," Harriet said. She had noticed that Faith was no longer behind her. She turned back, her expression shifting from pleasant to concerned. "Is there a problem?" Officer Brooks looked directly at her. "This doesn't involve you, ma'am," he said. His voice carried a note of warning. "Please continue." But Harriet didn't continue. Instead, she hovered, her protective instinct overriding her natural deference to authority. "This is my neighbor," she said, using the term loosely but purposefully. "Perhaps you could explain what this is about?" "Ma'am," Brooks said, and there was something in his tone, something that made it clear he would escalate the situation if she pushed further. "I need you to keep moving." Harriet looked at Faith. She saw the fear in the girl's eyes, and she made a decision that she would later realize was the pivot point of everything that would follow. She pulled out her phone. "Excuse me," Faith said to Officer Brooks, her voice trembling slightly. "My mother is expecting me. I have an airport escort meeting me. If you could just—" "I said, come with me," Brooks interrupted. He reached out. He gestured for her to follow him with a movement that was less invitation than command. "Now!" Faith glanced back at Harriet, who nodded at her with an expression that said, "Go ahead, but I'm watching." It was meant to be reassuring, but all it did was confirm that something was very wrong. She followed Officer Brooks off the jet bridge and into the terminal, her heart hammering in her chest, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to articulate. Officer Brooks led Faith to a more isolated section of the terminal, away from the main flow of passengers, away from the places where people were expecting to greet arriving travelers. It was a quiet area, a secondary corridor that few people needed to access. Faith felt her anxiety building with each step. "Why am I being—" She started to ask, "Do you know why I'm speaking with you?" Brooks interrupted, his tone suggesting that he was asking a serious question, as if she should understand something that hadn't been explained. "No," Faith said. "You were reported," Brooks said. "There's a concern." "A concern about what?" Faith asked. Her voice was shaking now. She was 13 years old, a girl who'd never been in trouble, who'd never so much as gotten a detention, and she was being interrogated by a federal officer in a way that made her feel like a criminal. "About your behavior on the flight," Brooks said. He was studying her face intently, as if looking for signs of deception, signs of guilt, signs of anything that would confirm whatever narrative he'd already constructed. "My behavior?" Faith said, confusion adding to her fear. "I didn't do anything. I read on my phone. I listened to music. I slept a little." "You were reported as acting suspicious," Brooks said. "I was acting normal," Faith replied. She could hear the tremor in her voice now. "I was just flying to DC." Brooks stepped closer. "Why are you so nervous?" "Innocent people don't act this nervous." And there it was, the trap that so many people fall into, the mechanism by which fear itself becomes evidence of guilt. Faith's natural nervousness at being interrogated by a federal officer, her natural anxiety at being isolated from other people, her natural fear response to an authority figure who had shown her no kindness. All of it was being interpreted as suspicious behavior, as evidence that she had something to hide. "I'm nervous because you're questioning me," Faith said. She tried to sound logical. She tried to appeal to reason. "I haven't done anything wrong. You fit a profile," Brooks said. His eyes had narrowed. "Folks like you, sometimes they come through these airports thinking they can get away with things, thinking the rules don't apply." And there it was, the moment when it became clear to Faith what this was actually about. It wasn't about her behavior, it wasn't about anything she'd actually done, it was about what she looked like. It was about assumptions being made about her. Based on her skin color, her age, her appearance? That's not fair, Faith said quietly. Fair, Brooks said. Tell me what you're really doing in DC. I'm going to a special event, Faith said. My mother arranged it. She's expecting me. What kind of event? Brooks demanded. I don't know exactly, Faith said, which was more or less true. Something at the Capitol. Brooks's expression shifted, not toward belief, but towards something that looked like confirmation of his suspicions. Someone so young, so vague about where she was going alone, being secretive about her purpose. In his mind, she fit a pattern he'd decided on long before this conversation began. We need to get to the bottom of this, Brooks said. Come with me. He gestured toward an interrogation room, a small windowless space adjacent to the main security area. Inside the interrogation room, Officer Brooks set down Faith's pink carry-on. He stared at it as if it might contain something dangerous. Open it, he said. Faith hesitated. She was 13 years old. She didn't know her rights. She didn't know that she could refuse a search without a warrant. She didn't know that what Officer Brooks was doing was technically illegal. All she knew was that she was alone in a room with a federal officer who seemed convinced that she'd done something wrong, and she was terrified of making the situation worse. She opened her carry-on. Inside was her Marvel backpack, her tablet, a book she'd been reading, some snacks her mother had packed for the flight, and a travel-sized container of her favorite lotion. Nothing suspicious, nothing illegal, nothing that could justify the search that was about to happen. But Officer Brooks went through each item methodically, and with each item he examined, his expression grew darker, as if he were looking for confirmation of guilt, and finding it in the innocent details of a 13-year-old girl's travel. When he reached the backpack, he unzipped it. Inside was her homework folder, her phone charger, and the cardigan her mother had given her. He pulled out the cardigan, and with it came the handwritten note, the note that her mother had tucked inside. What's this? Brooks demanded. He unfolded the note. It's from my mother, Faith said. Her voice had grown very small. Brooks read the note. Even when we're apart, we're connected. Show the world who you are. Make me proud. Mom. His expression hardened further. This doesn't prove anything, he said, as if Faith had been claiming it did. Could be forged. Could be something else entirely. Faith felt tears beginning to form at the corners of her eyes. Her mother's love, her mother's words of encouragement, were being treated as evidence of wrongdoing. I don't understand, Faith said. My mother gave that to me. It's just a note. Where's your mother? Brooks demanded. She's in Washington, Faith said. She's waiting for me. And what does she do? Faith hesitated. She wasn't sure why she hesitated. Maybe it was instinct, some part of her sensing that information was being weaponized. She works in government, Faith said finally. For the federal government. Doing what? Brooks pressed. She's an advisor, Faith said, which was technically true, though vastly simplified. Brooks set the cardigan and note aside. He continued going through her belongings, removing each item, examining it as if it might contain secrets. He found her tablet and turned it on. He scrolled through her recent activity. Schoolwork, some debate tournament videos she'd been studying, messages to her mother. You're very secretive for someone who claims to have nothing to hide, Brooks said. And Faith understood in that moment that there was nothing she could say or do, nothing that would convince this man of her innocence. She had already been judged. The investigation, if you could call it that, was designed, not to discover the truth, but to confirm a narrative that had been decided, before she ever landed in Washington. After nearly an hour of searching through Faith's belongings, and finding absolutely nothing to support any accusation, Officer Brooks' frustration reached a level where it was no longer possible to contain it. He had built himself up to the point of certainty. He had convinced himself not just that something was wrong, but that he was the righteous official who would uncover it. Finding nothing didn't dismantle that conviction, it merely transformed it. I'm going to be straight with you, Brooks said. His voice carried a tone of finality. I smell something on you. Something suspicious. Faith, sitting in that small room with her belongings scattered before her, shook her head. You don't. There's nothing to smell. I haven't done anything. Your answers are inconsistent, Brooks said, though there had been nothing of the sort. You're lying about who you're meeting and why you're here. I'm not lying, Faith said. Her voice had taken on a desperate quality now. I'm telling you the truth. Officer Brooks pulled out a small notebook. He began writing. The action itself was terrifying to Faith. Whatever he was writing, and she couldn't see the words, couldn't defend herself against accusations she wasn't even being allowed to hear, was becoming official record. What are you writing? Faith asked. My report, Brooks said, which will include your evasiveness, your suspicious behavior, and your inability to provide a coherent explanation for your presence on that flight. But I didn't do anything, Faith said. Tears were streaming down her face now. I just flew here. I was just going to meet my mother. That's what they all say, Brooks replied, as if Faith were one in a long line of guilty people who had sat in this room and claimed innocence. By this point, Harriet Moore was watching from the gate area, her phone still in hand. She had captured video of the entire interaction, from the jet bridge to the moment Officer Brooks had led Faith away. She had watched a federal officer single out a young teenage girl, for no apparent reason. She had watched him demand that she follow him. She had watched him isolate her from other passengers. What Harriet didn't know at that moment was something crucial. She had just become the only external witness to what was about to become a much larger story. What Harriet also didn't know was that her decision to keep recording, to gather evidence, to refuse to simply walk away, would become the pivot point. That would eventually tear apart Officer Randall Brooks's career and lead to changes that would affect thousands of people. But for now, all that existed was a frightened 13-year-old girl in an interrogation room, a federal officer with a notebook, and the false narrative that was being written down as official truth. Officer Brooks left Faith alone in the interrogation room. For another 20 minutes, it was a tactic, she would later understand, designed to build psychological pressure. But at 13, she didn't understand tactics. She only understood that she was alone, that no one knew where she was, that the hours were passing, and her mother was still waiting for her to arrive. When Brooks returned, he had his federal radio in his hand, and he was about to make a call. That would set official machinery in motion. "This is Officer Brooks," he said into the radio. "I have a situation at Reagan. Uncooperative passenger from Flight 2847 Atlanta to Washington. Potential security concern. Requesting backup and captain notification." "Uncooperative?" Faith said. "I've been answering all your questions. You've been evasive and inconsistent," Brooks replied. "Your story doesn't add up. This plane was en route with a potential threat, and you're acting like you don't understand the seriousness of the situation." The word threat hung in the air like a physical object. Faith had never been called threatening in her life. She played debate. She got good grades. She was the kind of girl people counted on, the kind of girl who raised her hand in class and had thoughtful things to say. And now she was being described as a threat over federal radio channels. Within minutes, other airport security personnel had appeared. A captain was notified. The entire incident had been elevated from a single officer's suspicion to something that involved multiple levels of authority. The false narrative, once spoken into official channels, had become something with institutional weight and momentum. They took Faith from the interrogation room and led her back out into the terminal. It was now past 5:30 in the evening. The airport was moderately busy, not packed, but full enough that there were witnesses, that there was an audience for what was about to happen. Officer Brooks had made the decision that Faith's removal from the terminal would be public and unmistakable. She was handcuffed, not tightly, not with any real necessity for safety, but handcuffed nonetheless, and led through the crowded areas of Reagan National. A teenage girl in handcuffs. That image alone was enough to cause people to stop and stare. That image alone was enough to confirm, in the minds of observers, that something serious had happened, that this girl must have done something significant enough to warrant federal custody. But worse than the stares of strangers was the presence of media. Several news organizations had camera crews at the airport for an unrelated story, but they turned their attention to this scene. A young girl being led away by federal officers. The cameras rolled. The moment was captured. The image of Faith Morris in handcuffs, her face flushed with shame and fear, would be the image that followed her. That shaped the initial narrative. That predisposed people to believe the worst about her. Harriet Moore, still in the terminal, still with her phone in hand, filmed this moment as well. She saw Faith being led away. She saw the cameras. She saw the public humiliation. And her expression hardened, with a kind of determined fury. She would not let this narrative be the only one. The flight attendant who had welcomed Faith aboard, the same woman who had been kind to her, approached a woman in a TSA supervisor's uniform. She spoke quietly. That woman was a witness, the flight attendant said. She pointed to Harriet, to everything. She recorded it. The interrogation at the federal detention area was more formal, more official, and more terrifying than the first. This time, Faith was in a room with 2 officers present, a digital recorder running, and the weight of official federal authority bearing down on her. "You're in serious trouble," one of the officers said. His name was Rodriguez. He was older than Brooks. His tone was more measured, but no less intimidating. "We need to understand what's happening here." "Nothing is happening," Faith said. Her voice was barely audible. "I was flying to DC. I was going to meet my mother." "What's your mother's name?" Rodriguez asked. Faith hesitated for just a fraction of a second, enough time for both officers to interpret it as suspicion. "Monique," she said. "Monique Morris?" "And what does your mother do?" the younger officer asked. "She works in government," Faith said. It was the same answer she'd given before, and it was still inadequate, still somehow wrong. "That's very vague," Rodriguez said. He leaned back in his chair. "You know, when innocent people are questioned, they usually provide more information, not less. They want to help clear things up, but you're being evasive." I'm not trying to be evasive, Faith said. I don't know what you want me to say. The officers continued questioning her for another 2 hours. They asked the same questions repeatedly, varying the wording slightly each time, as if consistency in her answers would somehow be proof of lying, rather than proof of truth. They treated her silence on certain topics as suspicious. They treated her attempts to answer as evasive. There was no narrative that could satisfy them, because the purpose of the interrogation was not to discover the truth, but to create an official record that justified what they'd already decided. Throughout this time, no one had asked her if she needed water. No one had offered her the phone call that she had a right to make. No one had attempted to contact her mother. No one had considered that perhaps a frightened 13-year-old girl might be telling the truth. At 6:15 in the evening, Officer Brooks made a decision. That would prove to be his critical miscalculation. He decided to call the emergency contact number, listed in the airport system for Faith Morris, not to apologize, not to explain the situation, but to inform her mother that her daughter had been detained on suspicion of security violations. Senator Monique Morris, who had been waiting at the Capitol for her daughter to arrive, received a call at 6:16 from Reagan National Airport Security, informing her that her daughter had been detained. The explanation was vague, the details were unclear, but the message was unmistakable. Something had happened, something serious enough that federal security was involved. Monique didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for clarification. She didn't request more information over the phone. She left the Capitol immediately. She cancelled her remaining obligations, and she drove to Reagan National at a speed that was probably not entirely legal. She arrived at the security offices at 6:47, and her presence changed everything. Senator Monique Morris walked into the security area with the kind of authority that came from years of navigating political institutions. She was a tall woman, dark-skinned, with her hair pulled back in a precise bun, and an expression that immediately made clear to everyone present that they were about to be questioned, rather than the other way around. "I'm Monique Morris," she said to the officer at the front desk. "My daughter Faith was brought here about an hour ago. I need to see her immediately, and I need an explanation of what's happening." Within moments, she was led to the interrogation room, where Faith was sitting alone, looking exhausted and terrified. When she saw her mother, she broke. The composure she'd been maintaining, the attempt to appear unafraid and unbroken, crumbled completely. Tears streamed down her face as her mother pulled her into an embrace. Over the next few minutes, Monique extracted the entire story from Faith. The confrontation on the jet bridge, the search of her belongings, the interrogation, the false accusations, and as she listened, her expression transformed. There was fury there, yes, but something more calculated than simple anger. There was the look of someone processing a situation, understanding its implications, and determining how to respond. She turned to Officer Brooks, who had remained in the room watching this reunion with visible discomfort. "I want to see the official report," Monique said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried absolute authority. "Mrs. Morris," Brooks started. "It's Senator Morris," she corrected coolly. "And I'm not asking. I want to see the official report. Right now." The power dynamic in the room shifted immediately. Brooks, who had exercised complete authority over Faith just moments before, found himself facing someone whose actual authority exceeded his own. He produced the report, watching as Monique read it carefully, her expression growing darker with each line. "Officer Brooks," she said, looking directly at him, "where is the specific evidence for any of these allegations? The behavior, the evasiveness?" Brooks attempted. "That's not evidence," Monique interrupted. "That's observation. Where is the actual evidence of illegal activity? She was reported..." Brooks started again. "By whom?" Monique asked. "Provide me with the name of the person who reported her." "Anonymous report," Brooks said, and he could see on Monique's face the exact moment she realized the entire foundation of this detention was built on nothing but assumption and bias. "So," Monique said carefully, "you detained my daughter, a 13-year-old girl, on the basis of an anonymous report, with no specific accusations, and you've kept her in interrogation for several hours, without contacting her family, or offering her access to legal counsel, all based on your observations of her behavior, which you've interpreted as suspicious, despite the fact that she hasn't done anything." "She wasn't cooperative," Brooks began. "She's cooperating with you right now, Officer Brooks," Monique said, "and I'm going to give you 60 seconds. Either formally charge my daughter with a specific crime or release her. You have 60 seconds. The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Brooks looked at the supervising officer, Rodriguez, who had the sense to understand that this situation had fundamentally changed. There was no charge, there was no evidence, there was nothing, but the fact that a federal officer had made an assumption about a teenage girl and had then spent hours trying to justify that assumption by treating her normal anxiety as suspicious behavior. "Miss Morris," Rodriguez said carefully, "we're going to release your daughter. There's no charge." "It's Senator Morris," Monique said again, this time with an edge. that made clear she would not tolerate further disrespect. And we're going to be having a conversation with your supervisor about this situation, as she led Faith out of the interrogation room. Monique kept her hand on her daughter's shoulder, not to comfort her, but to make clear to everyone watching that Faith was under her protection now, that the authority dynamic had shifted, and that consequences were coming. That evening, while Faith was at their hotel recovering from the traumatic experience, Monique received a message from Harriet Moore. The older woman had managed to find contact information for the senator's office through the flight attendant. She had sent a message that read, "I witnessed everything. I have video. Do you want me to send it to you?" Monique called Harriet's number immediately. "I recorded the entire incident," Harriet said, "from the moment that officer approached her on the jet bridge until they took her away. If it helps, I want you to have it. Send it to me," Monique said. "And Harriet, thank you. What you did matters." Monique watched the video that night after Faith had fallen asleep. She watched as Officer Brooks approached her daughter. With no explanation, she watched as Harriet tried to intervene and was threatened. She watched as her 13-year-old child was led away from safety. She watched as her daughter was treated like a criminal, despite having done nothing wrong. And watching that video, something crystallized in Monique. This wasn't just about Brooks. This wasn't just about her daughter. This was about the fundamental dysfunction of a system that would allow someone to abuse federal authority against a child, that would provide no meaningful oversight or accountability, that would enable this behavior to continue unchecked. She made phone calls that night to a civil rights attorney she knew, to federal prosecutors she'd worked with, to people in positions where they could actually do something about what had happened. By the next morning, the federal government's wheels were beginning to turn. Harriet Moore's video footage was clear and undeniable. It showed Officer Brooks's aggression. It showed Faith's cooperation. It showed the complete absence of any justification for the detention. It showed Harriet asking for an explanation and being threatened. By the time Monique had shared this video with her legal team, it had already been viewed by thousands of people on social media. The narrative had shifted. What had begun as a story of a problematic officer and a detained child had become a story of institutional failure, of federal authority being abused against a minor, of a system that was fundamentally broken in ways that affected communities across the nation. The first news organization to pick up the story ran it with a headline that read, "Federal Officer Detains 13-year-old Without Cause at Reagan National." The second news organization expanded the scope. Pattern of profiling emerges from TSA officer's record. By the time the third news organization broke the story, reporters had already begun investigating Officer Brooks's background. They had found records of his complaints. They had begun reaching out to other people who claimed they'd been targeted by him. Sitting in her Senate office the morning after her daughter's detention, Monique Morris made a decision that would ripple far beyond her own family. She could have taken the quiet path. She could have negotiated a settlement, secured a quiet apology, and moved forward with her life. She could have done what many parents in her position did, protected her family from further scrutiny, allowed the system to handle things privately, accepted that this was an isolated incident. But Faith had been changed by what happened. Monique could see it in her daughter's eyes, a wariness, a diminishment of the confidence that had always been so fundamental to who Faith was. And the more Monique thought about it, the more she realized that no settlement, no apology, no quiet resolution would address what had actually happened here. This wasn't about Officer Randall Brooks, or rather it was about him, but only as a symptom of something much larger. "I'm going to pursue this fully," Monique told her legal team. "Not just for settlement, for actual accountability, federal charges if possible, a complete investigation into how this was allowed to happen. That's going to make this very public," her attorney warned. "Your daughter will have to testify. This will be documented. It will affect her." "It's already affecting her," Monique said. "And what message does it send if I protect myself by staying silent? What message does it send to Faith if her mother, who has the power and position to actually do something, doesn't use that power?" That afternoon, Monique issued a public statement. "My daughter was wrongfully detained by Officer Randall Brooks at Reagan National Airport yesterday." The statement read, "She was handcuffed, interrogated without explanation, and treated as a criminal, despite the fact that she had done nothing wrong. This behavior is unacceptable. It is illegal, and it will be held accountable. We will be pursuing all available legal remedies, including federal charges against Officer Brooks, and a complete investigation into how this occurred." The federal investigation into Officer Brooks began immediately. Within days, federal investigators had uncovered his personnel file. Within a week, they had found 18 previous complaints. 18. The number itself was staggering, and the more investigators looked, the more they discovered. This was no anomaly, no single instance of bad judgment. This was a pattern. A documented, recorded, habitual pattern of racial profiling, aggressive interrogation, and abuse of federal authority. 11 of the 18 complaints involved people of color, 7 involved specific allegations of racial language or racial targeting. 6 had been summarily dismissed by the TSA. 4 had been quietly settled. 8 had simply vanished into administrative processes that seemed designed to prevent accountability rather than ensure it. What made the investigation particularly compelling was the video evidence. Harriet's footage was clear and incontrovertible. There was no room for interpretation. There was no way to claim that Faith had been uncooperative or suspicious. The video showed exactly what had happened: an officer making assumptions, an officer escalating without cause, an officer abusing his authority against a child. Other victims of Officer Brooks came forward as well. A 22-year-old man described being detained multiple times over a 3-year period. A 19-year-old woman described being subjected to an aggressive search of her belongings. A 25-year-old woman described being interrogated for hours based on an anonymous report. That was never substantiated. Each story followed the same pattern. Each story revealed the same methodology. Each story demonstrated that Officer Brooks had developed a way of operating that allowed him to target specific populations, to treat them as threats, to create false narratives around his actions, and to do so with the assumption that he would face no meaningful consequences. As the federal investigation deepened and the media attention intensified, Officer Randall Brooks experienced something like psychological collapse. The narrative he had constructed, the story in which he was the righteous official uncovering threats to public safety, was crumbling in real time. His image, carefully curated, his authority unquestioned, his actions justified by institutional inertia, was being dismantled publicly. His supervisor called him in, informed him that he was being placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome. His colleagues, sensing which way the wind was blowing, began distancing themselves. His wife, reading the news, began having conversations with a divorce attorney. At night, alone in his house, Brooks watched the video that Harriet Moore had recorded. He watched himself approaching a frightened 13-year-old girl. He watched himself threatening an elderly woman who had tried to advocate for the child's safety. He watched himself conducting an illegal search, making false accusations, creating lies in an official report, and he couldn't seem to reconcile that person with the person he believed himself to be. Social media erupted with calls for his arrest, for his imprisonment, for consequences that far exceeded what any legal system would likely provide. Hashtag Justice for Faith began trending nationally. People who had never known Faith Morris, who had never encountered Officer Brooks, took up her cause as if it were their own, because in some way it was. What had happened to Faith had happened, in different forms, to countless people, and now there was video evidence. Now there was institutional investigation. Now there was the possibility that someone might actually be held accountable. 37 days after Faith Morris's wrongful detention, Federal Prosecutor Sandra Chen held a press conference. "I am announcing formal federal charges against Officer Randall Brooks," Chen said. "The charges include deprivation of civil rights under color of law, false imprisonment, and filing false official reports." The charges carried maximum sentences of 5 to 10 years in federal prison. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was documented. The case was essentially airtight. "This case," Chen continued, "represents a fundamental failure of an institution entrusted with protecting the public. Officer Brooks exploited his federal authority to target a minor based on assumption and bias. He then used official channels to create false documentation of alleged crimes that never occurred. The federal government will not tolerate this behavior." Officer Brooks was arrested at his home that morning. He was handcuffed, escorted from his house by federal agents, and his mugshot was broadcast on national news. The officer who had detained a 13-year-old girl without cause was now experiencing the exact same treatment: the cuffs, the public removal, the official processing as a criminal. Media outlets ran extended pieces about the investigation. They published the timeline of his previous complaints, the details of other victims, the documentation of institutional failure that had allowed him to continue operating, despite multiple allegations. One headline read, "Federal investigation reveals TSA officer's 12-year pattern of targeting minorities." Another read, "How one officer's abuse led to federal investigation of entire institution." 3 months after being charged, Officer Randall Brooks was scheduled for a federal trial. The case had become national news. The evidence was so clear that his legal team made what many observers considered a strategic error. They insisted on taking the case to trial, rather than accepting a plea agreement. That would have reduced his sentence. But before the trial began, something unexpected happened. The Department of Defense, learning that the victim in this case was the daughter of a sitting US senator, and understanding the national security implications of federal authority being so egregiously abused, decided to make a statement on the morning of the trial. A military honor guard arrived at the federal courthouse. 43 soldiers in full ceremonial dress uniform lined the exterior of the building, standing at attention as Faith Morris and her mother arrived. A military commander in dress blues held the courtroom door open. As Monique and Faith entered, the message was unmistakable, unmissable, and overwhelming in its symbolic weight. The United States military was standing with this child. The warrior nation that had been built on principles of protection and justice was validating her experience and endorsing her courage in coming forward. Faith, who had been terrified of public trials and legal proceedings, walked between that honor guard and felt something shift in her understanding of her place in the world. She had been isolated and attacked. She had been afraid, but she had not been abandoned. And the institutions that were supposed to protect the public were, however imperfectly, beginning to do their jobs. The federal trial lasted 5 days. The prosecution presented the video evidence first. Harriet Moore testified, her elderly voice steady and clear, as she described what she had witnessed. The flight attendant testified about Brooks's aggression. The TSA investigator testified about the pattern of complaints, the institutional failure, the documented history of abuse. Faith testified for 2 hours. She described her fear, her confusion, her sense of injustice, at being treated as a criminal for no reason. And she did it with the kind of composed clarity that came from being a young woman who was intelligent enough to understand what was happening and courageous enough to speak about it publicly. Officer Brooks' defense consisted largely of denial. He claimed he had followed protocol. He claimed his suspicions were justified. He claimed that Faith's nervousness demonstrated guilt rather than fear. But the video contradicted everything he said. The evidence overwhelmed his narrative. The jury took 90 minutes to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Faith and Monique held hands. As the verdict was read, there was no triumph in the moment, only a kind of grim satisfaction that the system, when forced to actually do its job, had produced the correct outcome. The federal sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Federal Judge Maria Santos, an African-American woman with 25 years of judicial experience and a deep commitment to civil rights cases, presided. She listened as Brooks's lawyer requested a lighter sentence, citing his years of service and family hardship. She listened as federal prosecutors outlined not just this single case, but the entire pattern of Brooks's misconduct, and then she announced the sentence. 7 years, she said, in federal prison. The room was silent. Officer Brooks, Judge Santos continued, you took an oath to protect. Instead, you targeted. You took a vulnerable minor and treated her as a criminal, based on nothing but assumption and bias. You exploited the trust placed in you by the federal government and the public. Federal prison is appropriate. Judge Santos then addressed the broader issues that had allowed this to happen. This court notes, she said, that Officer Brooks was able to engage in this conduct for 12 years, despite 18 previous complaints. This represents a fundamental failure of the Transportation Security Administration to police its own. This court is ordering a federal investigation into TSA complaint procedures nationwide. This court is ordering the implementation of mandatory body cameras for all federal security officers. This court is ordering mandatory civil rights training for all federal law enforcement personnel. This court is ordering the establishment of an independent review board for TSA officer complaints. Officer Brooks was remanded into federal custody immediately. Federal marshals led him from the courtroom in handcuffs, the same kind of public removal that he had subjected Faith to, but now with the full weight of federal justice behind it. Monique and Faith embraced in the courtroom. There was relief in the moment, but not joy. Justice had been served, but it required a 7-year sentence and federal reform to correct what should have been preventable in the first place. Monique's civil lawsuit against the Transportation Security Administration and the federal government proceeded despite the criminal conviction, the federal government facing overwhelming evidence, and the political liability of a sitting senator's daughter being wrongfully detained by federal officers, did something unexpected. They settled $1,800,000. The settlement money was substantial, but the real victory was in what else the government agreed to. The TSA would implement the reforms Judge Santos had ordered immediately. They would establish a nationwide complaint tracking system that would automatically flag officers with multiple complaints. They would implement mandatory body cameras. For all security officers, they would conduct comprehensive civil rights training. For all personnel, they would establish an independent review board with the power to investigate complaints and recommend discipline. 3 other victims of Officer Brooks came forward. The young man who had been detained multiple times. The 2 women who had been subjected to aggressive searches. They each came forward to join a class action lawsuit. They each received settlements. The total institutional accountability exceeded $4 million for the first time. There was a sense that the system had been forced to actually reckon with what had happened, and more importantly, to change itself in ways that would affect future victims. Faith did not want to become an activist. She was 13 years old. She wanted her life back, wanted her sense of safety restored, wanted to be just a normal teenager, dealing with normal teenage concerns. But she understood, in a way that few people understood, that what had happened to her was not unique, that there were countless people who had experienced the same thing, federal agents making assumptions, using the authority of government to enforce prejudice, and facing no meaningful consequences because they knew how to operate within systems designed to protect them. When Monique introduced federal legislation the Civil Rights Protection for Detained Minors Act. She asked Faith to testify before Congress. Faith prepared carefully. She wrote down what she wanted to say. She practiced saying it without crying, though she allowed herself to cry, because crying was honest. She testified before a congressional committee. At age 13, her voice clear and steady, describing what it felt like to be detained without cause, to be treated as a criminal, to have her mother's love used as evidence of wrongdoing, to have her innocence weaponized against her. And the committee listened, because she was credible, because the evidence was overwhelming, because her mother was a senator, but also importantly because the story was true. The legislation passed with bipartisan support. It didn't solve police abuse or federal misconduct. It didn't eliminate racial profiling or institutional racism, but it did something important. It made it harder for officers to detain minors without cause. It required documentation and transparency. It created pathways for accountability. 6 months after Officer Randall Brooks was sentenced to federal prison, Faith Morris returned to something resembling normal teenage life. She was different, though. People who knew her could see it. There was a caution in her that hadn't been there before, a wariness of authority figures that was completely justified and understandable. But still a loss. Still a piece of her childhood that had been taken. But there were other changes too. She had become, almost without intending to, an advocate for civil rights. She received letters from other teenagers who had experienced similar things: wrongful detention, aggressive interrogation, the feeling of being targeted, based on how they looked. She responded to those letters. She connected people with legal resources. She became in many ways a voice. For a population that didn't have many voices, Harriet Moore, the elderly woman who had recorded the video, and had subsequently become one of Faith's most important witnesses, remained close to the family. She attended Faith's school events. She wrote letters of support. She had become, improbably, part of the family. That had been forever changed. By that one day at Reagan National Airport, Monique's legislation became a model for other states. Other jurisdictions began implementing similar protections. Other agencies began examining their own complaint procedures, their own patterns of misconduct, their own failures. The Department of Transportation Security underwent a comprehensive audit. 47 violations by other officers were identified using the new complaint tracking system that had been implemented as part of Brooks's settlement. Some of those officers were disciplined. Some were fired. Some faced criminal prosecution. The system began, slowly and imperfectly, to hold itself accountable. Officer Randall Brooks served his 7-year sentence. In federal prison, he was released at age 48, permanently barred from any federal law enforcement position, convicted felon with a record that would follow him for the rest of his life. His career, his marriage, his reputation, all of it had been destroyed, and it had been destroyed because he had made the choice, over and over again, across 12 years, to exploit his authority and to target people based on assumptions and bias. But the most important outcome was simpler and more profound. The next young person who was wrongfully detained would have protections that hadn't existed before. The next officer who wanted to abuse his authority would face systems and oversight that didn't exist before. The next institution that wanted to ignore patterns of misconduct would face federal scrutiny that hadn't existed before. One girl's courage had rippled outward in ways that she couldn't have imagined, and while that girl still carried the trauma of what had happened to her, while she still sometimes felt fear when she saw a federal officer, while her childhood had been altered in ways that could never be fully repaired, she also knew something important. She knew that her experience had mattered. It had meant something. It had changed something. She had spoken truth, and truth had changed the world, even if only incrementally, even if only in small ways. That would only matter to people in situations she hoped would never happen to anyone. 3 years after her wrongful detention, Faith Morris sat in the audience at a high school debate tournament. She was no longer competing. She had stepped back from organized debate, needing space from the institutional structures that defined her. But she had come to watch other young people engage in the same form of intellectual combat that had been such an important part of her own life. Harriet Moore sat beside her, now in her 70s, still engaged, still paying attention to the world around her. As they watched the final round of competition, a young black girl took the stage to deliver her closing argument. The topic was civil rights and federal accountability. The girl spoke about patterns of misconduct. She spoke about the importance of oversight and transparency. She spoke about how institutions could be forced to change when people refused to accept injustice. When the round ended and the judges announced the verdict, the girl won. As she walked off the stage, she made eye contact with Faith and gave a small nod of recognition. She had known who Faith was. She had known the story. She had been influenced, in some way, by that story. Harriet reached over and squeezed Faith's hand. "You did that," Harriet said. I just spoke the truth, Faith replied. Yes, Harriet said, and speaking the truth changed things. Officer Randall Brooks would serve his full sentence. He would be released to a world that knew his name, that understood what he had done, that would never allow him to hide from his actions. The system that had protected him for 12 years had finally, when forced, acknowledged what should have been obvious all along. But more importantly, the systems that had enabled him, that had allowed him to operate for 12 years, despite 18 complaints, had begun to change, imperfectly, slowly, but measurably. And it had happened because one girl had refused to stay silent, because one elderly woman had decided to record evidence, because one senator had used her power to demand accountability. This was not a fairy tale. Justice was not swift or complete. Change was not simple or total. But justice had come, change had happened, and the next person faced with similar circumstances would have protections that hadn't existed before. That mattered. That meant something. And as Faith Morris sat watching another young person, advocate for exactly the principles that her experience had come to represent, she understood something profound. She understood that her trauma, while real and lasting, had been transformed into something else, into a legacy of accountability, into a demand that institutions serve everyone, not just those deemed acceptable, not just those who fit the right demographic profile. If you found this story compelling, if it moved you to think about the institutions that are supposed to protect us, and the ways they sometimes fail to do so, if it reminded you of the importance of speaking truth, even when it's difficult and costly, and requires tremendous courage, then please subscribe to our channel. Because stories like this one matter. Stories of ordinary people refusing to accept injustice. Stories of systems being forced to change. Through persistence and evidence and public accountability. These are the stories that matter most.